A millionaire married a humble, unaesthetic gardener with the intention of getting revenge on his ex, but on their wedding night, he is surprised to discover that she, Eliseu Costa, stood by the massive glass window of his luxurious penthouse, gazing out at the sprawling city of São Paulo. The metropolis pulsed with endless energy, mirroring the relentless drive that had fueled his rise to power. The skyline was ablaze with lights, but even their brilliance couldn't quell the storm of anger raging in his chest. The life he'd painstakingly built was a testament to his ruthlessness and unyielding hunger for control. Yet, tonight, it all felt hollow. What burned most wasn't just the ache of abandonment, it was the sting of betrayal from Raquel, his former fiancée. Months earlier, Raquel had left him for a business rival, a man with less stability but more thrill, or so she'd thought. The memory of their last conversation played like a broken record in his mind. Thrill! He had scoffed bitterly to himself. He'd spent years constructing a flawless future for the two of them, only to be discarded like an unwanted pawn in some cruel game of chess. What haunted him wasn't just her departure, but the public humiliation that came with it. Her betrayal wasn't merely a heartbreak, it was a wound to his pride, a scar on his dignity. For weeks, Eliseu had drowned in memories, but tonight, something shifted. A spark ignited within him. It was time to act. Eliseu vowed to show Raquel and everyone else that he wasn't broken. In fact, he'd thrive. He crafted a plan, simple but brimming with dark satisfaction. He'd marry someone who embodied everything Raquel was not. A woman of simplicity, free from the vanity and pretension that had defined his former relationship. This wouldn't just be a marriage, it would be the ultimate revenge. The next morning, Eliseu strolled through the sprawling garden of his estate. The scent of freshly planted flowers hung in the air, but he barely noticed. His mind was consumed by his newfound purpose. That's when his gaze fell upon a woman kneeling in the dirt, her hands covered in soil as she carefully pruned a shrub. The scene was so unassuming yet oddly captivating. Her presence exuded an understated grace, her face glowing with a quiet radiance. There was a peace about her, a stark contrast to the chaos Raquel had left behind. She was everything Raquel wasn't. She was real. She looked up, catching sight of him. A gentle smile spread across her face, her voice breaking the stillness of the morning. "Good morning, Mr. Costa," she greeted, her tone warm and unpretentious. "Good morning, Raquel," he replied, stumbling for a moment before correcting himself, realizing her name wasn't Raquel. It surprised him how intrigued he felt, drawn to the simplicity and authenticity she radiated. For the first time in months, Eliseu felt a flicker of something new, a curiosity, a pull toward a different path, one he hadn't anticipated. "How long have you been working here?" Eliseu asked, trying to mask the growing interest in his voice. "Almost 2 years, sir. I've been taking care of the garden since the estate was renovated," she replied with a polite smile. He nodded, but his mind lingered on one thought. She had something Raquel never did. Authenticity. The woman before him didn't need makeup or empty words to stand out. She was genuine, unapologetically herself, without pretense or disguise. And in that moment, Eliseu realized she might just be the key to his plan. Over the following days, Eliseu began spending more time around Joyce Oliveira as he learned her name. Their conversations, initially about the garden, became more frequent and personal. He discovered she was a resilient woman who carried the weight of caring for her ailing mother, someone who depended on costly, ongoing medical treatments. Despite her struggles, Joyce never complained, dedicating herself to her work with a quiet determination that impressed him deeply. One afternoon, while Joyce was arranging tools in the garden, Eliseu decided it was time to act. He couldn't wait any longer. "Joyce, can I speak with you about something important?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with hesitation. She looked up, surprised but curious, and nodded. "Of course, Mr. Costa. I need your help," he said, his tone now more serious. "I have a project, and I think you're the perfect person to help me with it." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What kind of project? I want to get married, he stated bluntly, watching the shock register in her expression. To me? Joyce asked, her voice unsteady, unsure if this was some kind of cruel joke. Yes, Elizu replied without hesitation, but it won't be a traditional marriage, so don't worry, let me explain. He then laid out his plan. Joyce would become his wife, but not out of love. It was a calculated move to show Raquel and everyone else that he had moved on to something better. He needed a wife who was the opposite of Raquel, someone without vanity or false promises. In return, Elizu would cover all of Joyce's mother's medical expenses, ensuring she received the care she needed. Joyce's sharp gaze met his, unflinching. You're a cold man, Mr. Costa, she said without hesitation, but I can't let my pride stand in the way of my mother's well-being. I'll do it, but let me be clear. I'm only agreeing for her sake. Elizu felt a dark satisfaction. He had secured exactly what he needed. This will work out for both of us, trust me. Joyce gave a humorless smile. Trust you? Now you're asking for too much. The deal was made, and Elizu believed he had everything under control. Joyce, however, felt a mixture of relief and unease. As she returned to her work in the garden, an odd sense of foreboding crept over her. She'd agreed for her mother's sake, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this decision would lead her down a far more complicated path than she had anticipated. From his window, Elizu watched her closely. She was the perfect piece for his game. But what he didn't realize was that in trying to manipulate fate, he was setting off a chain of events that would change his life in ways he could never foresee. Fate, with its twisted sense of humor, was about to teach him a lesson he never asked for. The grand event hall sparkled with thousands of lights, reflecting the elegance and buzz of São Paulo's elite. Every detail had been meticulously curated by Elizu Costa. The gourmet buffet, the sophisticated decor, the air of luxury, everything was designed to leave an impression. This wasn't just a party, it was a statement. Elizu was back, stronger than ever. And this time, he wasn't alone. Beside him stood Joyce, his new wife. Her presence turned heads, sparking whispers and curious glances. She wasn't the type of woman one expected at his side, but that was exactly the point. Elizu's game was in motion, and for now, he believed he was in control. When she entered the room at Elizu's side, the energy shifted instantly. It was as if the very air thickened, charged with tension. All eyes turned to the couple, and the lively hum of conversation dissolved into hushed whispers. Raquel wore a simple blue dress, a stark contrast to the extravagance that surrounded her. Her hair was tied back modestly, and though her posture exuded confidence, the nervous flicker in her eyes betrayed her unease. She felt the weight of every stare, as if she were standing trial in an invisible court where judgment had already been passed. Sensing her tension, Elizu leaned in and whispered softly, "Relax, Raquel. Just smile and leave the rest to me." She managed a small smile, but inside, every step felt like walking a tightrope under the scrutiny of an unforgiving crowd. The room was stifling, and with each move she made, she felt the gaze of 100 silent critics. Among the sea of onlookers, one person stood out, Joyce Oliveira. Her fiery red dress screamed for attention, a bold and deliberate statement in a room full of subtlety. Her piercing gaze locked onto Elizu's, and the sly smile that crept across her lips was a clear signal she was ready for confrontation. "Elizu, darling," Joyce's voice rang out, sugary sweet but laced with venom. She approached with a champagne glass in hand, her every move calculated to draw attention. "What a surprise to see you looking so refreshed." "Joyce," Elizu replied coldly, his tone sharp enough to cut. "I see you haven't changed." She chuckled, brushing off his disdain like it was nothing, then turned her attention to Raquel, her gaze sharp and critical. "And this must be your fiancé? Such an interesting choice." Raquel felt her cheeks flush at the veiled insult. But before she could respond, Elizu stepped in, his voice steady and unflinching. "Raquel is everything I've ever wanted in a wife. authentic, loyal, and above all, genuine. The words landed like a slap, and Joyce's smile faltered for the briefest moment before she recovered, her eyes flashing with barely concealed resentment. The evening wore on, and Raquel did her best to mingle, but the conversations felt like thinly veiled interrogations. Every question carried a note of condescension, every compliment a hidden barb. One particularly smug woman asked with feigned curiosity, "So I heard you used to be a gardener." "Yes," Raquel replied, with her head held high, her voice steady. "It's honest work, and I've always been proud of it." The woman blinked, caught off guard by the firmness in Raquel's tone, and quickly retreated. Slowly, Raquel began to sense a shift. Though the scrutiny was unrelenting, her unapologetic authenticity seemed to earn her a glimmer of respect from some of the guests. From a distance, Eliseu watched it all unfold, waiting for Raquel to stumble, to falter under the pressure. But instead he saw a woman who faced the night with courage and dignity, even as her nerves occasionally showed. She wasn't just a pawn in his game. She was carving her own space, and that unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite define. The tension peaked when Joyce reappeared, her smile radiant, but her eyes blazing with challenge. "May I steal a moment of your time?" she asked, her voice dripping with honeyed sweetness, masking the venom underneath. Eliseu hesitated, but followed her to a quiet corner of the room, away from prying eyes. Once alone, Joyce dropped all pretense, her intentions clear as day. "So, this is what you've resorted to now?" Joyce's voice dripped with sarcasm as she crossed her arms, her disdain practically radiating from her. "Lowering yourself to this level just to provoke me? This has nothing to do with you, Joyce," Eliseu replied, his tone calm and steady. "Oh, spare me the act," she scoffed, her lips curling into a smug smile. "Do you honestly think this little marriage charade is fooling anyone?" She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing with malice. "That girl doesn't belong in our world, and you know it." What's your problem, Joyce?" Eliseu shot back, his voice sharper now, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Is it that I'm happy, or is it that you've lost your grip on me?" Joyce took a step closer, her eyes blazing with fury. "You can pretend all you want, Eliseu, but deep down, you know I'm the only one who truly understands you." "You're wrong," he said firmly, his gaze unwavering, "and this conversation is over." He turned on his heel and walked back into the main hall, leaving Joyce fuming in the shadows. Raquel stood near the drinks table, clutching a glass of juice. When she saw Eliseu approaching, a faint sense of relief crossed her face. But there was something in her eyes, something unspoken, that made him pause. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice tinged with genuine concern as he stepped closer. "Surviving," Raquel replied with a timid smile, her attempt to mask the tension falling just short. Her emotions lingered beneath the surface, raw and unmistakable. Eliseu opened his mouth to say more, to offer something that might ease the weight of the night for her, but he stopped himself. There was something about her, a quiet strength, an unshakable resolve that defied his expectations, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The night stretched on, but something had shifted. For Raquel, it was the growing realization that her journey would be far more challenging than she had imagined. And for Eliseu, it was the creeping awareness that his carefully laid plans were spiraling into uncharted territory. Joyce, on the other hand, wasn't ready to let things rest. The fire she carried burned fiercely, ready to consume anyone in its path. The next morning, Raquel found herself navigating the imposing corridors of Eliseu's mansion. It was grand, almost palatial, with endless halls bathed in soft light and adorned with expensive art. But to her, it felt more like a cold, suffocating labyrinth. Each perfectly placed piece of furniture seemed to mock her presence, reminding her she didn't belong. It was her first day as Eliseu Costa's wife, and the weight of that reality pressed down on her with an intensity she hadn't expected. Descending the grand staircase, she was greeted by a breakfast table that seemed almost absurd in its opulence. Exotic fruits, pastries, and dishes she couldn't name stretched across the length of the table, creating a feast fit for royalty. "Good morning, Mrs. Costa," said a stern-looking housekeeper. Her tone was formal, almost clipped, as though every word was a reminder that Raquel was being watched. "Good morning," Raquel replied, her smile polite but nervous. She sat down, feeling the unspoken judgment in the room. The staff exchanged glances, their expressions betraying their confusion. To them, she was still the gardener, a woman who should be outside tending to the roses, not sitting at the head of the table. Eliseu entered moments later, his presence commanding as always. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, radiating the confidence of a man who knew exactly where he belonged. "Hope you slept well," he said casually, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "It was different," Raquel admitted, her words carefully chosen. She couldn't quite articulate the strangeness of being surrounded by so much luxury, yet feeling entirely out of place. Eliseu nodded absently, his attention already on his phone. For him, their marriage was a transaction, a means to an end. She had a role to play, and he expected her to fulfill it seamlessly. "We have an event tonight," he said without looking up. "You'll need to be ready." "An event? What kind of event?" Raquel asked, her curiosity tinged with unease. "A dinner with some important partners," Eliseu replied. "I need you to appear calm and confident." Raquel raised an eyebrow, the frustration creeping into her voice. "And how exactly am I supposed to do that?" He finally looked up, meeting her gaze with an expression that hinted at something deeper, perhaps understanding, perhaps exasperation. Taking a deep breath, he said simply, "Just be polite and smile." She bit back a sarcastic remark and finished her breakfast in silence, the mix of frustration and helplessness settling over her like a heavy cloak. That night, as Raquel prepared for the event, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into a battlefield disguised as a dinner. Meanwhile, Eliseu, oblivious to the storm brewing around him, remained focused on the chessboard he thought he was controlling. But what neither of them knew was that this game was about to take an unexpected turn, and the pieces were far from predictable. Throughout the day, Raquel tried to find some semblance of a routine within the mansion's grand walls. But every attempt reminded her that this place wasn't her home. It was a gilded cage. The staff treated her with respect, but it was the kind of respect that felt forced, as if they were just waiting for her to slip up. In one corner of the sitting room, two maids polished vases and whispered to each other, unaware that Raquel was within earshot. "I still can't figure out how she managed to marry him," one murmured. "It's probably just temporary." "No way, this is serious," the other replied, her soft laughter like a knife to Raquel's chest. Her face burned with shame, but instead of confronting them, she quietly walked away. Comments like these had followed her ever since the engagement had been announced. Yet no matter how many times she heard them, the sting never dulled. As evening fell, another challenge awaited her: the dinner. She wore a gown chosen by a stylist hired by Eliseu, a dress that was stunning and expensive, but felt like a costume, not her. At the event, Raquel put on her best smile, engaging in polite conversation with the guests. But every interaction felt like walking a tightrope, her discomfort palpable in her every move. Then, in an unguarded moment, she accidentally spilled a small splash of wine onto the tablecloth. One of Eliseu's business partners made a sarcastic comment, and Eliseu seized the opportunity to subtly reprimand her. Leaning in close, he whispered, his tone icy, "Be more careful." Raquel straightened her back, refusing to wilt under his words. With quiet resolve, she replied, "I'm not a perfect doll, Eliseu." He didn't respond, but the tension between them thickened. When they finally returned to the mansion, the air between them was electric with unspoken frustration. In the dimly lit living room, Raquel could no longer contain her emotions. "I get it now," she began, her voice trembling but steady. "You only want me here as some kind of trophy to show off. But that doesn't mean you get to treat me like I'm less than you." Eliseu stared at her, caught off guard by her boldness. He had never expected her to stand up to him like this. "That's not what this is about," he said, his tone measured. "You knew what you were getting into when you agreed to this marriage." Raquel let out a bitter laugh, her eyes flashing with frustration. "Oh, I know exactly what this is about. You used my circumstances against me. You don't care who I am, as long as I serve your purpose." Eliseu's jaw tightened, his voice rising, laced with a hint of disdain. "And what's wrong with that? You agreed to the terms. What's changed now?" She stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "What's wrong is that I'm not like you, Eliseu. I care, I feel. And if you can't see people for more than what they can do for you, then the real loss is yours." Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion that even Eliseu couldn't dismiss. He stood silent, his fists clenched at his sides. For the first time, he was at a loss for words. Raquel turned and walked away, heading for the bedroom without another glance. Left alone in the quiet room, Eliseu felt the weight of her words settle over him. Deep down, he knew she was right. But something inside him resisted that truth. She wasn't just another piece in his carefully constructed game. She was becoming something more, someone who challenged him in a way he hadn't anticipated, and that unsettled him in ways he didn't fully understand. That night, the mansion was steeped in silence, but it wasn't peaceful. Raquel and Eliseu retreated to separate rooms, the tension between them an invisible force that lingered, heavy and undeniable. The next day, the car glided smoothly down the road, the hum of the engine filling the quiet space between them. They were headed to a luxurious charity event at a seaside hotel, meant to raise funds for an educational foundation. Despite the ever-present tension between Raquel and Eliseu, something felt different that morning. The usual discomfort seemed to have eased, allowing her to relax slightly and lose herself in the passing scenery without the need for constant conversation. "You're unusually quiet," Eliseu said, breaking the silence. His eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. Raquel raised an eyebrow, glancing at him sideways. "Is that a problem?" He let out a light sigh. "No, I just thought you might have questions about the event." "I don't, but thanks for the concern," she replied with a touch of irony that didn't go unnoticed. Eliseu suppressed a smile. Raquel's quick wit and sharp replies intrigued him in ways he couldn't quite explain. Something about her always kept him on his toes. When they arrived at the hotel, Raquel was shown to the suite Eliseu had reserved for her. The room was grand, complete with a balcony overlooking the shimmering ocean. She stood there for a moment, taking in the breathtaking view, but quickly reminded herself not to be distracted by the facade. There was more at stake than the beauty of her surroundings. As she prepared for the evening, Raquel chose a dress that balanced elegance with simplicity, a reflection of her own authentic and grounded nature. When she descended to the lobby to meet Eliseu, she noticed the flicker of surprise in his eyes. He quickly masked it, but not before she caught the brief moment of impact her appearance had on him. "You look nice," he remarked, his voice dry but laced with sincerity that he couldn't entirely hide. Raquel nodded briefly. "Thank you," she replied, her tone even. The ballroom was a display of opulence. Men and women dressed to perfection mingled, their polite smiles hiding underlying agendas, while jewels sparkled under the glittering lights. Raquel felt the familiar grip of unease in her chest, but steadied herself with a deep breath. She wouldn't let the weight of the evening overwhelm her. She would face it with dignity. As they moved through the room, Raquel noticed that Eliseu seemed more relaxed than usual. He wasn't scrutinizing her every move or firing quiet remarks her way. The subtle shift in his demeanor made her lower her guard, if only slightly. Later, during a break for drinks, the two found themselves seated at a small, secluded table. For the first time, their conversation took an unexpected turn. "What was your life like before all this?" Eliseu asked, his voice carrying a rare note of genuine curiosity. Raquel hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, but eventually decided to answer. "I grew up in a modest neighborhood. My dad passed away when I was very young, so it was just me and my mom. We had to manage on our own, and I started working early to help out at home." She paused, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her glass. When she got sick, things became even harder, but I did what I had to do to take care of her. Elizu listened intently, his expression uncharacteristically soft. There was something in the way she spoke, calm yet resilient, that captured his attention. Her struggles were undeniable, but the quiet strength behind her words left an impression he couldn't ignore. In that moment, surrounded by the hum of idle chatter and clinking glasses, something shifted between them. Neither of them acknowledged it outright, but the air seemed lighter, the barriers between them just a little less imposing. "And you?" She shifted the conversation. "What was it like growing up with everything handed to you?" Elizu gave a bitter smile. "Growing up surrounded by wealth isn't as simple as it looks. My father expected perfection from me in everything. When he passed away, all the responsibility fell on my shoulders, whether I was ready for it or not." He paused, an unusual occurrence for him. "Then Joyce came along. I thought I'd finally found something that wasn't about business or expectations, something that was just mine. But I was wrong." Raquel stayed silent for a moment, letting his words sink in. She could sense something had cracked in Elizu. Behind the mask of power and control was a man carrying more than he let on. "Sounds like both of us had to grow up too fast," she said softly, her tone laced with a compassion that caught him off guard. He looked at her, surprised by the empathy in her voice. For the first time it felt like someone truly saw him, not just the polished exterior, but the person beneath it all. But just as this fragile connection began to form, Joyce appeared, sweeping into the room with her signature confidence. Her presence immediately turned heads, her stride purposeful as she made her way to where Raquel and Elizu were seated. Her eyes sparkled with a mix of challenge and mischief, setting the stage for a confrontation. "Raquel," Joyce began, her attempt at politeness barely masking the sarcasm, "you look stunning tonight." "Elizu has excellent taste, doesn't he?" "Joyce," Raquel responded with a serene smile as if unfazed. "I noticed well, tonight too." Joyce let out a clipped laugh, though her eyes glinted with veiled malice. "Tell me," she continued, her tone dripping with mockery, "it must be quite the adjustment, From gardener to magnate's wife. I hope it's not too hard keeping up." Raquel felt the sting of the words but refused to let it show. She took a deep breath, holding her composure. "It's certainly a big change," she replied firmly, "but I've always believed that authenticity shines through no matter the setting." Joyce's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing as she registered the sharp yet poised response. Before she could fire back, Elizu stepped in. "Joyce," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel, "why don't you enjoy the party somewhere else? I'm sure you'll find someone more interested in your insinuations." Joyce shot Raquel one last glance before retreating, her irritation obvious. Raquel, though rattled internally, maintained a steady demeanor. When Elizu looked at her, there was something unspoken in his gaze, something that made her feel a flicker of relief. "You handled that well," Elizu said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I won't stoop to her level," Raquel replied firmly. "No matter what, I won't let anyone disrespect me." She was strong, unyielding, and completely unexpected. As the night wore on, Elizu couldn't shake the thought that Raquel might be more than just a convenient ally in his plans. Perhaps she was exactly what he needed to rediscover something he'd lost long ago, a real reason to keep going. The day began like any other. The first rays of sunlight bathed the mansion in a golden glow, and Raquel found herself in the garden, the only place that still offered her a semblance of peace. A housekeeper approached, her expression unreadable, and handed her an envelope. "This came for you, Mrs. Costa," she said. Raquel was startled to find the sender unidentified. She opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the plain sheet of paper inside. Her breath caught as she read the elegantly penned, yet coldly impersonal words. "You will never be one of us. Stop pretending before it's too late." The message lingered in her mind, and a chill ran down her spine. She clenched her jaw, taking a deep breath to push back the growing mixture of fear and anger. The last thing she wanted was for Elizu to find out. He would either see it as a weakness or worse, use it against her. Determined not to give her anonymous tormentor the satisfaction, Raquel tucked the letter into her bedroom drawer, vowing to ignore it. She had bigger plans, and no one, absolutely no one, was going to get in her way. But the days that followed brought an unsettling escalation. That first note had only been the beginning. More envelopes began to arrive, each filled with sharper, crueler words. Imposter, fraud. You'll never be worthy of the Fonseca name. The weight of the messages pressed down on her like a growing storm, but Raquel knew she couldn't falter. In Elizu's world, even the smallest sign of vulnerability could be exploited. She carried on, maintaining her composure in public, but the unrelenting stream of letters tested her resolve. And as if that wasn't enough, Joyce seemed to always be nearby, ready to add fuel to the fire. Whether at events, meetings, or any place Raquel and Elizu were expected to be, Joyce was there, her comments and glances like carefully aimed daggers. It became clear to Raquel that Joyce wasn't just being hostile. She was waging a calculated psychological war. Then, one afternoon, Joyce made her most direct move yet. She strode into Elizu's office, her expression carefully crafted to convey urgency. But Raquel had seen that look too many times before. Behind the facade of importance lay one simple goal: to create chaos. Joyce crossed her legs with calculated poise as she settled into the chair across from Elizu. "We need to talk about an old business partnership," she began, her tone dripping with false charm. Elizu didn't bother to look up from his papers, his expression as cold as ever. "Make it quick, Joyce, I'm busy," she smiled, a hollow, insincere smile. "Oh, come on, you're not just busy with business, are you? You're busy trying to convince everyone, and maybe even yourself, that you're happy with her." For the first time, Elizu looked up, his sharp gaze cutting through her facade. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone flat. "I'm just concerned about you," Joyce replied with mock innocence. "Everyone knows Raquel doesn't belong in this world. She's going to drag you down, Elizu. There's still time to fix this, to avoid disaster." Elizu stayed silent for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm. "Fix what? Do you really think you can erase the past and walk back into my life as if nothing ever happened?" Joyce leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with malicious intent. "You can deny it all you want, but I know you still think about me. This marriage, it's a sham, and you know it." The silence that followed was heavy, the air thick with tension. Elizu didn't flinch, didn't waver. When he finally broke the stillness, his voice was resolute. "You're wrong. Now, if you have nothing else to say, I suggest you leave." Joyce stood, frustration flashing across her face, but she wasn't defeated, and both of them knew it. This wasn't over. Later that night, as Raquel slept peacefully, Elizu entered their bedroom to retrieve some documents. As he opened a drawer, his eyes landed on a stack of envelopes. Curious, he picked them up and began reading. The words, venomous and cruel, were like daggers on the page. "You'll never belong. Imposter. Stay in your place." He read each one silently, his jaw tightening with every line. Anger surged within him, not the calculated, controlled anger he was used to, but something raw and unrelenting. These were the kinds of words he might have once wielded as weapons in his own battles. But now they ignited something different. Raquel wasn't his enemy, she was his wife. Elizu carried the letters to his office, his mind racing. He couldn't let this go on. Not like this. The next morning, as they sat at the breakfast table, he broke the silence with a direct question. "Why didn't you tell me?" He placed the letters on the table, his gaze steady and serious. Raquel froze, her cheeks flushing with a mix of anger and embarrassment. She hadn't expected him to find the notes, let alone bring them up. "Because it's none of your business," she said, reaching for the papers. But Elizu caught her hand before she could take them. His grip was firm, his voice low and deliberate. "It is my business. You're my wife, Raquel. This affects me too." She stared at him, caught off guard by the intensity in his voice. For the first time, she sensed something in him she hadn't before. a genuine concern that went beyond strategy or appearances. A few days later, at a high-profile event they attended together, tensions reached their peak. Joyce, as expected, seized the moment to throw another verbal jab at Raquel. Surrounded by guests, she smiled sweetly as she spoke, her words laced with venom. "It's truly admirable how you've managed to adapt to this world," she said. "You almost make it look natural." Before Raquel could respond, Eliseu stepped in. Wrapping an arm around her shoulders, he fixed Joyce with a stare so cold it could freeze the room. "You're absolutely right, Joyce," he said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "This world is intimidating, but Raquel is stronger than anyone here, stronger than you, that's for sure." Joyce's confidence faltered, her smile slipping as she realized she'd lost control of the moment. She tried to mask her frustration, but her gaze betrayed her defeat. Raquel, on the other hand, stood tall, the weight of Joyce's words no longer bearing down on her. For the first time, she felt that Eliseu wasn't just tolerating her presence in his life. He was standing by her, seeing her as someone worthy of respect, and perhaps, just maybe, as someone he truly cared for. The room fell completely silent. No one in the room expected Eliseu, a man known for his coldness and his ability to manipulate people, to take such a firm stand in Raquel's defense. Joyce was left speechless, her once unshakable confidence clearly rattled by Eliseu's unexpected response. Raquel, on the other hand, felt a mixture of relief and confusion. She knew Eliseu as a calculated man, someone who made decisions with precision and care. But in that moment, he didn't seem to be protecting his own image. He was genuinely standing up for her, and that, in a way, caught her off guard. Later that evening, when they returned home, Raquel couldn't hide the gratitude in her voice. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. Eliseu looked her straight in the eyes, his tone firm and resolute, something she hadn't heard from him in a long time. "I did. I'm not going to let anyone disrespect you." His words wrapped around her like a warm embrace. But Raquel still wasn't sure she could fully trust that protection. Something was shifting between them, but both of them knew it was too complicated to fully understand. The game Eliseu had started was beginning to slip out of his control, and he had no idea if he was ready to face the consequences of his own choices. Hours later, Raquel sat alone on the small couch in the bedroom she occupied in the mansion, staring at the pregnancy test she held in her hands. The two pink lines seemed to glow before her eyes, almost like they were shouting at her. The air in her throat felt thick, and her mind raced, trying to comprehend what this meant. She squeezed her eyes shut as if doing so would change anything, but it didn't. Fear, doubt, and for a brief moment, a fleeting glimpse of happiness mixed inside her chest. Since agreeing to marry Eliseu, her life had been a whirlwind. She never imagined, not for a second, that something as big as a pregnancy could happen. And in a moment like this, in a marriage that felt more like a transaction than a genuine bond, she felt that the last thing she wanted was to be a mother. Raquel spent hours wrestling with how to tell Eliseu. He was a man used to controlling everything around him, and she feared that upon learning of the pregnancy, he would see it as a burden, an obstacle to the game he was still trying to control. She knew Eliseu didn't want to be trapped in a relationship he saw as nothing more than a strategic alliance. Yet the thought of keeping this truth hidden ate away at her from the inside. Later that day, after a long meeting, Eliseu returned to the mansion. He found Raquel sitting alone on a wooden bench in the garden, tucked under the comforting shade of a tree. Her face was pale, and there was something in her eyes that told him something was wrong. "Is everything okay?" he asked, noticing the unusual stillness in her demeanor. Raquel paused for a moment, knowing what she had to say wouldn't be easy. "We need to talk," she finally said, meeting his gaze head-on. Eliseu watched her carefully, a frown knitting his brow. His expression began to harden, as if he already sensed that something serious was coming. "You seem different. What happened?" he asked, his voice now low, serious. Raquel took a deep breath, trying to summon the strength she needed. I'm pregnant." The words hung heavily in the air between them. For a few seconds, Eliseu didn't say anything. His usual impassive expression wavered, revealing a mix of conflicting emotions. He seemed stunned, as if the information was too overwhelming to process. Surprise was clear, but there was something else there. Doubt, fear, maybe even confusion. It was as if the world around him had slowed down for just a moment. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual, almost as if he was afraid to hear an answer he didn't want. "I am," Raquel replied, trying to hold her ground. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, an almost instinctive gesture of defense, as though that would shield her from something she didn't yet understand. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating for Raquel. This wasn't part of any plan. Neither of them had seen this coming. Raquel looked at Eliseu, trying to read his face, but he was so distant, lost in his own thoughts, that it was impossible to tell what he was truly feeling. This moment would change everything, but she didn't yet know how far it would go. "What are we going to do?" Raquel finally asked, stopping in her tracks and locking eyes with Eliseu. "I'm having this baby," Raquel answered, her voice firm. "But don't expect anything from me, Eliseu. I don't want you thinking I'm using this to manipulate you." Her words hit him like a punch, but deep down, he knew Raquel wasn't the kind of woman who would use such a tactic. Still, the idea that anyone might think he was being manipulated bothered him deeply. "Don't say that," Eliseu replied, his voice lower, but with a sincerity he barely recognized in himself. "This child is mine too, and I'm going to take responsibility." His gaze softened, but there was still caution in it. Eliseu knew that being a father wouldn't be easy, and he wasn't sure if he could fully trust what he was saying. But in that moment, something shifted within him. It was as if, suddenly, the weight of his past decisions, the relentless pursuit of power and revenge, began to lose their meaning. In the days that followed, Eliseu found himself struggling to adjust to the idea of becoming a father, a role he had never expected to face. He felt a jumble of emotions swirling inside him, leaving him confused and distant. But there was something about Raquel's pregnancy that began to spark a shift within him. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning his priorities and rethinking the emptiness of his obsessive pursuit of revenge. But as always, peace was short-lived. Joyce, ever watchful of Eliseu's life, quickly caught wind of the rumors about Raquel's pregnancy. She wasted no time in trying to destabilize their relationship. At a social event, Joyce approached Eliseu, her smile sweet, but her posture exuding superiority. "Congratulations, Eliseu," she said, her voice syrupy with a hidden venom. "I hear you're going to be a father. Seems Raquel is smarter than I thought." She narrowed her eyes slightly, a thinly veiled jab aimed directly at him. "What do you mean by that?" Eliseu asked, his tone sharp, though he kept his composure. "Oh, nothing," Joyce said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Just find it curious how she managed to get pregnant so quickly, don't you?" She tilted her head theatrically, masking the malice in her words. "Watch what you say, Joyce," Eliseu replied, his voice low and menacing, his gaze never leaving her. "I'm just saying, some women know exactly how to secure their place," Joyce retorted, feeling she'd struck a nerve. "A baby always changes the rules of the game, doesn't it?" Eliseu stood in silence, his fists clenched tightly, but in his mind he wasn't playing Joyce's games anymore. For the first time, he realized how insignificant all of it truly was. Later that night, after returning home, Eliseu found Raquel in their room. She was sitting on the bed, a book in her hands, but her gaze was distant. Her eyes seemed lost, as though she was still processing everything that had been happening. "Joyce knows," Eliseu said, cutting straight to the point. Raquel looked up at him, surprise flashing across her face, quickly followed by concern. "How did you know?" she asked, trying to mask her anxiety. "It doesn't matter," Eliseu replied, sitting beside her. He sighed, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "What matters is that she's going to try to use this against you." A wave of tension washed over Raquel, but hearing Eliseu's words brought a strange sense of calm. He wasn't pulling away. He wasn't retreating. Somehow he was with her, and as improbable as it seemed, it made her feel like maybe, just maybe, he was starting to commit to something more than his quest for revenge. "Of course," she said, her voice steady. "The only thing she wants is to tear us apart, but she won't succeed." Eliseo's voice grew resolute as he spoke, his determination cutting through the room. "No, she won't." Raquel watched him, surprised by the firmness in his expression. It was clear to her that despite his doubts, Eliseo was more present than she ever imagined he would be. They were far from having everything figured out, but for the first time, Raquel felt that maybe the pregnancy could change something between them. Maybe it was their chance at a new beginning. The afternoon sky was overcast when Eliseo received a message from Joyce asking to meet. He knew he couldn't avoid it, but curiosity, something he hadn't expected to feel, pushed him to agree. There was something in her words about finalizing unfinished business that made him wonder if this meeting was going to mark the end of a chapter he had been trying to close. He knew Joyce was a master of manipulation, but a part of him hoped this would finally be the moment when he could close that door for good. The meeting was set at an exclusive, quiet restaurant, far from the prying eyes of the city. The atmosphere was calm, but inside, Eliseo was a storm of conflicting thoughts. What could Joyce possibly want now? He had no idea what she was planning, but he knew it wouldn't come without an agenda. Joyce arrived a few minutes later, radiating her usual self-assurance. The dress she wore seemed tailor-made to impress, and her smile, though familiar, didn't stir up any of the emotions from their past. Eliseo observed her with a detachment that somehow surprised him. "Eliseo," she said, sitting down at the table without waiting for an invitation. He looked at her, unhurried, as if in no rush to react. "Thank you for coming," she added, trying to start the conversation with an air of lightness. "Be quick, Joyce," he responded, direct and to the point. He wasn't interested in small talk. Joyce leaned forward, elbows on the table, as if to dominate the space between them. "It doesn't have to be so cold. I thought, after everything that happened, we deserved at least one honest conversation," she said, her voice trying to sound warm. Eliseo raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Sincerity was never your strong suit, Joyce," she chuckled, attempting to maintain her composed front, though it was clear that his words had stung. "I know I made mistakes, but who hasn't? We're human, aren't we? Can't we redeem ourselves? Are you giving me a speech or trying to justify something?" Eliseo crossed his arms, unhurried in processing her words. Joyce paused, studying him with a more calculating gaze. The mask she had worn so carefully began to crack, but she quickly gathered herself. "I was wrong, Eliseo," she admitted, her voice slipping for a moment. "I was so focused on work, so distant from everything and everyone." "It's not about what I did or didn't do, Joyce," he interrupted, his voice low but steady. "You chose betrayal. I wasn't the only one at fault. It was what we had, what we built." She turned her gaze away for a moment, processing his words, but quickly regained her composure, trying to take control of the situation again. "And now, you're with Raquel, a woman who has no idea how to survive in this world," she said, her voice dripping with provocation as she studied him closely. Eliseo narrowed his eyes, his tone shifting. "Don't talk about her," he warned. But Joyce didn't back down. Instead, she leaned in closer, eager to continue her taunts. "You know it's true," she pressed, a smirk playing at her lips. "Look at her. Raquel doesn't understand your ambition or the need for control. You know this won't last." A heavy silence settled between them, the tension almost suffocating as Eliseo locked eyes with her. He seemed unfazed by Joyce's attempt to provoke him. Surprisingly, he smiled. But it wasn't the warm smile of old. It was cold, distant, almost cruel. "You know what's interesting, Joyce?" he said, leaning back in his chair as if preparing to drop a bombshell. "For a long time, I thought I needed you. I believed your betrayal was proof that I wasn't good enough." Joyce stiffened, unsure where he was going with this, but he continued, his voice calm yet sharp. "But now, I see what was really going on. My obsession with you wasn't love, it was ego. I needed to prove something to myself, to you, and to the world. I couldn't stand the idea of losing, but now you mean nothing to me." His words hit like a thunderclap, filling the air between them with an explosive weight. Joyce tried to maintain her composure, but her hands were trembling, betraying her calm demeanor. Frustration surged through her body, though she fought to hide it. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice cracking, almost desperate. "I'm more serious than I've ever been," Elizu replied, standing up. He was done with the conversation. "Our past, Joyce, is over. My present is with Raquel." Joyce was frozen, unable to move as he began to walk away. But before he could turn the corner, she couldn't resist playing her final card. Later that evening, Elizu found himself in a prestigious restaurant, far removed from any distractions. On the outside, he remained calm, but inside, his thoughts were in turmoil. What could Joyce possibly want now? He knew she never approached without a reason, and something in his gut told him this conversation would be tense. Joyce arrived a few minutes later, exuding her usual confidence. Her dress, sophisticated and carefully chosen, was designed with one goal in mind: to impress. She approached with that seductive smile, but unlike before, Elizu felt nothing but coldness. What was she after this time? "Elizu," she began, sitting down without asking. "Thank you for coming." Elizu didn't waste time. He was impatient. "Just speak, Joyce," he replied bluntly. He had no intention of dragging this meeting out. She leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, as if preparing to reveal a great secret. "You don't have to be so direct," she said, trying to soften the mood. "After everything, I thought a real conversation was the least we could have." Elizu raised an eyebrow, giving her a skeptical look. "Sincerity was never your strong suit, Joyce." She forced a smile, trying to mask the irritation that was clearly rising within her. It was evident that his words had struck a nerve. "I know I made mistakes, but who doesn't? We're human, right? Can't we make mistakes and still try to make amends? Are you giving me a speech or trying to justify something?" Elizu cut her off, his voice low but firm. Joyce paused for a moment, studying him. The tension in the air grew, and Elizu could feel that she was carefully choosing her next words, but soon she regained her posture. "It was a mistake, Elizu," she said, her mask slipping for a moment. "I was so focused on work, so detached from everything." "It's not about what I did or didn't do, Joyce," Elizu interrupted, his gaze icy. "You chose betrayal. I wasn't the only one at fault. It was what we had, what we built." Elizu narrowed his eyes, his voice turning low and serious as he responded, "Don't talk about her." But Joyce wasn't one to back down. Her smile only grew wider as she pressed on. "You know it's true," she taunted, tilting her head slightly. "Look at Raquel. She doesn't understand your ambition or the need for control that drives you. This won't last." The silence between them was thick, almost suffocating. Elizu didn't flinch, but there was something in the way he looked at her, something that told Joyce that her words no longer had the same impact on him. Then, to her surprise, he smiled, but it wasn't a smile of affection. It was cold, distant, even cruel. "You know what's interesting, Joyce," he said, settling back in his chair. "For a long time, I thought I needed you. I believed your betrayal proved I wasn't enough." Joyce stiffened, unsure of where he was heading, but he continued, his voice now colder, sharper than ever. "But now I see what was really going on. My obsession with you wasn't love, it was ego. I needed to prove something, to you, to myself, to the world. I couldn't stand the thought of losing, but now you mean nothing to me." His words hit her like a slap, and Joyce's frustration was hard to mask. Her hands trembled, and she felt the heat of humiliation creeping up her neck. "You can't be serious," she murmured, her voice thick with desperation. "I'm more serious than I've ever been," Elizu replied, standing up. He turned his back to her, ready to leave. "Our past is over, Joyce. My present is with Raquel." She froze, paralyzed by the finality of his words. As he began to walk away, Joyce, in one last attempt to regain control, made one final move. Back at the mansion where Eliseo and Raquel had first met, the garden was being meticulously tended to. Eliseo, absorbed in the task of caring for the plants, noticed the subtle tension in Raquel's shoulders. Something was off. There was something she wasn't saying. "Joyce tried to threaten us," Raquel said, crossing her arms, her voice carrying a quiet strength. Eliseo sighed, but there was no surprise in his expression. He looked at her with calm eyes, though his mind was still processing the confrontation with Joyce. "She doesn't want anything anymore," he replied, his tone almost indifferent. Raquel met his gaze, her eyes sharp with determination. "I can handle it," she said, her voice stronger than ever. There was something in her he couldn't help but admire, but there was also an undercurrent of unease in her stance. "I told you, I can handle this alone. I don't need you," she added, not allowing herself to show weakness. She was trying to present an image of strength, as though there was no room left for vulnerability. But Eliseo felt a pull to get closer to her, to understand what she truly meant. Raquel interrupted him, her tone softer than he'd expected, almost surprising. "You have to handle it alone, Raquel," he said, his words carrying a sincerity that she couldn't ignore. She looked at him, surprised, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension in her eyes. But the genuine tone of his voice made her pause, and for a moment she wasn't sure what to make of it. There was something in his words that caught her off guard. That night, as Eliseo sat alone, reflecting on everything that had happened, he realized something had shifted within him. For the first time, he didn't feel weighed down by the past. For the first time, he desired something real. And when he looked at Raquel, that desire began to take shape. The next morning, an unexpected silence hung in the air at the mansion. Raquel sat at the breakfast table, flipping through a gardening magazine, trying to shake off the unease that gnawed at her. Something didn't feel right, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The silence was broken when Eliseo answered his phone. His voice was tense and alarmed, quickly grabbing Raquel's attention. "How did this get into the press?" he asked, standing up abruptly. "Find out who leaked this and fix it immediately." Raquel watched him intently, her curiosity piqued, as he ended the call with a grim expression. "What happened?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "It's about us," Eliseo said, running a hand through his hair. "Someone leaked our contract to the media." The words hit her like a ton of bricks, and Raquel barely had time to process the weight of what this meant. Before she could react, her phone buzzed. Messages, missed calls, news links, the screen filled with sensational headlines. The fake marriage of Eliseo Costa and Raquel Pereira. A financial agreement or true love. Sources reveal it all began with a contract. Raquel's stomach twisted as she read the details. The exposure of the contract was harsh, filled with derogatory comments and nasty speculation about their intentions. "It was Joyce," Raquel murmured, her voice low but filled with certainty. "It points to her," Eliseo replied calmly. "But we'll handle it. I'll get the lawyers and the media on it." "Handle it?" Raquel repeated incredulously. "You think you can control what people say about me, about us?" Eliseo tried to approach her, but Raquel took a step back. "Did you know this could happen?" Her voice trembled. "From the very beginning, you treated my life like a pawn in your game. I never wanted this to happen," Eliseo said, his voice sincere. "I'll protect you and the baby, no matter what it takes." Raquel let out a bitter laugh. "The only thing you've ever protected is your ego." Without waiting for a response, she turned and left the room, heading straight to their bedroom. Once there, she began packing her things, her hands trembling as she folded clothes and gathered the essentials. Eliseo found her soon after, his voice filled with concern. "What are you doing?" he asked, his tone tight with worry. "I'm leaving," she answered, not even glancing at him. "You can't leave," Eliseo said, stepping closer to her. "Not now. Not alone." Raquel was on the edge. Her life had turned into a nightmare she never thought she'd have to live. What had started as an effort to care for her mother and live a simple life had now morphed into a dangerous game she barely understood. And it was all because of Eliseo. She finally looked at him, no longer able to hide the storm of emotions inside her. "I can't stay here," she said, her voice shaky, her eyes brimming with tears. "All I ever wanted was to be happy, to live in peace. But you pulled me into your world, Eliseu, and now I'm just a target." Eliseu's gaze was heavy, filled with remorse, but there was also a determination in his eyes, something he wasn't sure she'd recognize. "I'll fix everything, Raquel," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Trust me." Raquel let out a bitter laugh, her face streaked with tears that had long since stopped being held back. "How can I trust you, Eliseu?" Her words cut through the room with so much pain that it felt like each one struck him in the chest. I don't know what to do anymore. You made me believe in something that wasn't real. How can I trust someone who used me as a pawn in their game?" He fell silent, the weight of guilt and the truth pressing down on him. Raquel closed her suitcase with resolve, unwilling to give in. As she took a step toward the door, Eliseu reached out, but she stood firm, her stance unshakable. "I need more than this," she said, her voice rough. "I need my son, my dignity. And here, with you, I have neither." Raquel walked out the door, leaving Eliseu standing there, feeling as though the world had collapsed beneath him. In the days that followed, the scandal spiraled beyond his control. The media was relentless, and with each new headline, Eliseu watched as his reputation was shattered piece by piece, yet none of it seemed to matter. All he could think about was Raquel. He tried calling her, reaching out, but every call went unanswered. That was when the full force of the truth hit him. He'd known from the start that he'd crossed a line, that his obsession with revenge and control had obliterated any chance of something real. What he felt for Raquel was genuine, and only then did he realize it was the only thing left in his heart. One gray morning, with the rain tapping on the car window, Eliseu made a decision. He let go of everything he'd known, for the first time pursuing something true. He drove to the small apartment where Raquel had gone to escape, far from his world, far from everything he represented. Raquel opened the door, her expression a mix of surprise and wariness. She knew why he was there, and the tension between them was palpable, but before she could shut him out, Eliseu spoke. "I was wrong, Raquel," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "From the start, I used you. I was selfish, and that's unforgivable. But Raquel, you changed everything. You changed me." Raquel crossed her arms, skepticism evident on her face. He felt the weight of her doubt, but he continued. "I'm not here to justify what I did," he said, meeting her eyes with a sincerity that even he couldn't quite believe. "I just want you to know that you're the strongest, most real person I've ever met. For the first time in my life, I want something real, and what I want is you." Raquel stood motionless, her thoughts racing as Eliseu's words hit her with unexpected force. There was something in his gaze, a sincerity she hadn't seen before, that made her hesitate. "I don't expect you to forgive me right now," Eliseu said quietly, his voice full of determination. "But I will fight for you, for us." She met his eyes, and in that moment, there was an internal struggle within her. The pain, the betrayal, and yet a glimmer of hope she couldn't quite push away. She knew it would be hard, but there was something in his sincerity that felt impossible to ignore. "This isn't going to be easy," she finally said, her voice heavy with resignation. "I don't expect it to be," Eliseu replied, his resolve clear. "I just want the chance to try, to start something new." Raquel held his gaze for a moment longer, the weight of doubt still heavy in her chest. But for the first time since leaving the mansion, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was something more between them, something stronger than their past mistakes. Maybe, with time, it could grow into something real. The sky remained overcast, the rain falling gently over the city as Eliseu stood outside Raquel's apartment, watching the world pass by. He knew the man he had been before was gone. Losing Raquel had made him realize that nothing else mattered, except what was right in front of him now. And what he wanted, more than anything, was to show her that he was willing to change. In the days that followed, Eliseu stepped away from his usual world. He handed over his responsibilities at the company, paused his relentless pursuit of power, and focused on one thing: winning Raquel back. He knew she didn't trust him, and rightfully so. But now, he was determined to prove that his intentions had truly shifted. Raquel found herself torn between conflicting emotions. Despite the ache in her heart, something was beginning to shift within her. No matter how hard she tried to push it away, there was a part of her that wanted to believe Eliseu was being honest. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, what once seemed impossible now felt like something she could at least consider. Her life, it seemed, had turned into a battleground between doubt and hope. Eliseu, on the other hand, understood that he had to make a bold move, something that would take him out of his comfort zone, something that wasn't just for Raquel, but for the world to see. He wanted to prove, without any doubt, that he was committed to changing for her. And so, his plan started to take shape, simple in its execution, but carrying all the sincerity of his intentions. The next morning, Raquel received an unexpected letter. The envelope was plain, without any extravagance, but her name was written by hand, and the handwriting, though simple, was unmistakable. Inside, there were only a few words, but they stopped her in her tracks, something stirring deep inside her. "I would like you to be here tonight. I don't want to pressure you, but it's important to me." Raquel hesitated, but there was something about the words, something in the tone, that made her decide. She didn't know what to expect, but the curiosity was too strong to ignore. When she arrived at the location mentioned in the letter, her eyes widened in disbelief. The public garden, a place she knew well, had been completely transformed. The flowers were in full bloom, soft lights flickered gently around the space, and the benches, once worn and forgotten, were freshly painted, now radiating a cheerful, renewed spirit. In the center, a small stage had been set up, and a few neighbors had gathered around, watching with keen interest, wondering what would happen next. Raquel walked slowly, still unsure of what was happening, until her gaze locked onto him. Eliseu stood on the small stage, and it took her a moment to recognize the figure before her. He was dressed simply, far from his usual polished appearance, but somehow that made him seem more human, more approachable. "Good evening," his voice echoed through the microphone, and Raquel felt her heart tighten in her chest. "First of all, I want to thank everyone for being here." Raquel stood still, her heart pounding in her chest, a mix of confusion and something else stirring inside her, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. "There's something I need to say," Eliseu continued, his voice trembling slightly in a way Raquel had never heard before. "Something important, and I want to say it honestly." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "All my life, I thought I could control everything. I believed people and situations were just pieces of a game, manipulable to serve my goals. And because of that, I made horrible mistakes." The silence that followed was thick, and Raquel's breath caught in her throat. She could feel each of his words like a sharp arrow piercing through her, her heart racing painfully in her chest. "But then I met someone who made me see the world differently," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Raquel, you taught me that life isn't a transaction, that what is real can't be controlled. You showed me that in sincerity, in authenticity, there is an immense strength. I don't need to hide who I am to deserve something true." Raquel felt his words wrap around her like a warm embrace, but the pain and mistrust still lingered, holding her back from fully letting go. Eliseu paused, taking a deep breath, as if searching for the courage to continue. "I was wrong with you, Raquel," he said, his voice now more vulnerable than she had ever heard it. "I was selfish, arrogant, and I couldn't see everything you meant. But now, the only thing I want is a second chance. I can't go back and erase what I've done, I know that. But I want to build something real with you, something genuine, something that has a future." Tears began to fall down Raquel's face before she could stop them. Each word Eliseu spoke seemed to echo inside her, deeply painful, yet carrying a fragile hope that she was terrified to let grow. She wanted to believe him, but the wounds from the past were still fresh, still raw. Raquel stood frozen, unsure of what to do or say. She simply let the weight of his words wash over her, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions, unsure how to make sense of them all. The audience watched in silence, their eyes on Raquel, as though the answer lay solely in her hands. Eliseu stood there, exposed in front of everyone, and for the first time he seemed to be speaking the truth. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and it was impossible for her to ignore. Raquel closed her eyes briefly, trying to piece herself back together. She wanted to believe him more than anything, but the pain was still too raw, too fresh. What Eliseu was asking for wasn't just a second chance. It was a plea for change. He was asking her to see the man he was trying to become, not the one he used to be. But Raquel wasn't sure she was ready to take that leap of faith. Eliseu understood the weight of his request. He knew he had to make a bold move, something that would push him out of his comfort zone and show Raquel and the world that he was serious about change. And so, a plan began to take shape. The following morning, Raquel received an unexpected letter. The envelope was simple, with her name written carefully by hand. Inside, only a few words, but they made her heart race. "I would like you to be here tonight. I don't want to pressure you, but this is important to me." Raquel didn't know what to think. It was an unusual invitation, but something about those words, so genuine, made her decide to go. When she arrived at the location, she was stunned by what she saw. The public garden, a place she had walked through so many times, was completely transformed. Flowers were in full bloom, soft, warm lights cast a magical glow across the space. The benches had been freshly painted, and a small stage was set up in the center, surrounded by a small crowd of curious neighbors watching in silence. Raquel walked towards the center of the garden, unsure of what to expect, until her gaze landed on him. Eliseu stood there on the stage, and for the first time he seemed different, simpler, more human. He was dressed modestly, unlike anything she had ever seen him wear before. "Good evening." Eliseu's voice echoed gently through the microphone. "First of all, I want to thank everyone for being here." Raquel's heart raced in her chest. Something was about to unfold, and she had no idea what to expect. "I know I can't just ask you to forgive me easily," Eliseu continued, his voice steady, but carrying an unfamiliar tremor. There was a nervousness in him, something rare, something Raquel had never seen before. "But if you give me the chance, I promise I'll do my best to be the man you deserve, for as long as it takes." Raquel stood silent, letting his words sink in, feeling the weight of the moment. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, but somehow she found the strength to speak. After a deep breath, she said, her voice steady yet layered with emotion, "Eliseu, you hurt me in ways I can barely put into words. But something has changed. You've changed. And if this is real, maybe we can try." In that moment, a humble smile crept onto Eliseu's face. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He knew that trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight. But right then, he felt a spark of hope, the first in a long time. As the night unfolded and they walked through the garden, Raquel felt something stir inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long while, a quiet sense that perhaps they were beginning to build something real. Eliseu had set aside his pride, and she was willing to offer him a second chance. They both understood that the journey wouldn't be simple, but they were ready to try, ready to be more than the ghosts of their past. Months passed, and life for Eliseu and Raquel began to take on a new shape. One peaceful afternoon in the garden, Raquel lay on a lounge chair, gently stroking her visibly pregnant belly. Eliseu sat beside her, wearing a rare, calm smile that she didn't see often. He was holding a book about fatherhood, something he had recently started reading, an unthinkable gesture for the man who had once been consumed by work and the pursuit of power. "You seem more nervous than I do," Raquel teased, noticing his anxious gestures as he flipped through the pages. "I want to be prepared," Eliseu replied, his smile a little sheepish. "I've made too many mistakes already, and I won't risk making the same ones again." Raquel squeezed his hand affectionately. "The fact that you care is more than enough. Our child will be so lucky to have you as a father." Her words warmed his heart in a way he didn't know was possible. He knew the weight of his past still followed him, but he was determined to be a better man, not just for Raquel, but for himself and the child they were about to bring into the world. Then, the night Raquel went into labor, the peacefulness vanished, replaced by frantic energy. Eliseu, though he had prepared himself, couldn't hide his panic. He gripped Raquel's hand tightly, driving her to the hospital while trying to comfort her. "Breathe, Raquel, everything's going to be okay," he said, but his voice betrayed his own nervousness. "I am breathing," she snapped, a mix of pain and irritation in her words. "You should try it too." At the hospital, time seemed to stretch for Eliseu. Seeing Raquel in the delivery room, fighting to bring their long-awaited child into the world, left him speechless. It was terrifying and awe-inspiring at the same time. Hours later, the cry of their baby filled the air, and the doctor handed the newborn to Eliseu. He stood still for a few seconds, holding the child in his arms, unable to believe he was really there, holding the son he had longed for. He looked at Raquel, exhausted but smiling, and felt a happiness he never imagined was possible. Pure, genuine, without ambition, without ego. "He's perfect," Eliseu whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he gently placed the baby in Raquel's arms. In that moment, everything clicked into place for him. What had once been the center of his life, control, success, revenge, now seemed small and irrelevant compared to the new family he had created. In the months that followed, Eliseu adjusted his routine to prioritize Raquel and Bernardo. He delegated responsibilities at the company, something he had always thought impossible, and began working hours that allowed him to be home every night. Raquel, in turn, found a balance between her new life as a mother and her own dreams. With Eliseu's support, she opened a small landscaping business, something she had always wanted to do but never had the chance to pursue. Their lives were changing, but this time, with more love and endless possibilities. When Raquel realized there was no longer a place for her in Eliseu's life, she made a painful but necessary decision. She acknowledged that all her attempts to fit into his world had been ignored, and the truth finally hit her. Eliseu's world had shifted, and she no longer had a role in it. One peaceful afternoon, Eliseu and Raquel strolled through the garden, holding little Bernardo in their arms. The baby looked around curiously, his eyes wide with wonder at the colorful flowers. Raquel let out a soft laugh as she watched her husband excitedly point out each bloom, as if they were the most incredible things in the world. "Who would have thought you, Eliseu, would be so passionate about flowers?" she teased, resting her head on his shoulder. "It's not the flowers," he replied with a tender smile, pressing a kiss to her head. "It's what they represent for us." Once those flowers had symbolized a relationship built on manipulation and ulterior motives. But now, to Eliseu, they were a symbol of true love and change. Each bloom was a reminder of a choice he had made, a choice to be better, to grow. For Raquel, the garden was proof that even the most complicated, painful stories could be transformed into something beautiful and full of life. As the sun began to set, they sat down on the grass, with Bernardo peacefully asleep in Raquel's arms. The moment felt like pure serenity. "Do you think he'll like flowers when he grows up?" Raquel asked, a soft smile playing on her lips. "He'll love them, and he'll learn from them," Eliseu answered, his gaze calm and full of certainty. Raquel looked at him, her heart warming, as she realized that the man beside her was no longer the calculating, proud Eliseu she had once known. He had chosen to change. He had chosen to grow, to seek redemption, and most importantly, to love. Their life might not have been perfect, but together they knew they could face any challenge that came their way. Bernardo wasn't just a new beginning. He was the proof that even after the harshest storms, there's always space for something new to bloom, something genuine and true. Did you like today's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with your friends. See you in the next video.